Did you know that China has had a 40-year economic boom to become the second largest economy in the world? The outcome? China's GDP increased by more than 9% a year on average between 1980 and 2019, rescuing approximately 800 million people from terrible poverty. Although it has been an amazing adventure, the forces driving this expansion are beginning to weaken and the winds are changing. The energy prices that drove China's manufacturing growth are rising. The capital inflows that once fueled the country's economic boom are now drying up, and the once unstoppable real estate market has encountered a significant obstacle. So what is the true nature of China's enormous debt bubble, and how is the country's leadership attempting to prevent it from popping? How are the international energy markets stoking the flames and putting China in an even more vulnerable position? What extreme measures in policy would the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, be compelled to implement in order to prevent the economy from collapsing? Let's explore the specifics. China's economic renaissance, the initial phase.
Overseas investors are leaving China in large numbers. Between April and June, overseas firms pulled out $15 billion, $15 billion taken out from the Chinese economy. This is a record exit. But it's hardly surprising. In the past 3 years, Chinese stocks have steadily declined as foreign investors have pulled out their money. And how much was the loss? At least $6 trillion. The steady outflow shows that China is unable to reverse the decline and restore confidence among foreign investors.
Ever pondered how China rode a 4-decade hot streak to become the behemoth it is today before we get into the probable collapse? China's economy is currently dealing with its most difficult problems since the Great Leap Forward, which resulted in 3 years of starvation and tens of millions of fatalities. But now is not the moment for China's adversaries in the geopolitical arena to rejoice. Since more than 120 of the 195 nations in the world rely on China as their main trading partner, any unrest in the Middle Kingdom will undoubtedly have an impact on the entire world. Under Deng Xiaoping's leadership, China commenced its remarkable economic growth story in the 1970s with the introduction of a set of changes known as reform and opening up. This marked a significant departure from the centrally planned economy that had characterized China's previous communist era. However, Deng was astute. He understood that it would be dangerous to turn a communist nation into a totally capitalist one, particularly if he wished to keep power. Thus, he restricted the use of these market forces to 4 SEZs. Trade in these walled-off zones was governed by a more market-oriented system that promoted international trade, private enterprise, and foreign investment. These special economic zones were a huge success, and in the early 1980s, they caused China's first significant growth spurt. Villages became thriving metropolises, productivity in agriculture increased, and living standards rose. China's economy was propelled by the emergence of manufacturing giants like Shenzhen. China's financial system was significantly impacted by this boom as well, especially in relation to state-owned companies, SOEs. The role of state-owned enterprises. These are businesses in which the government holds a sizable or controlling stake. The government frequently provides subsidies, low-interest loans, and preferential regulatory treatment to state-owned enterprises, SOEs, particularly in key industries like energy, telecommunications, transportation, and banking. However, there's a catch. In order to achieve public policy goals and government obligations, such as employment quotas, they must also comply. The CCP managed to direct private sector earnings into their centrally planned economic strategy. Stakes increased when these enterprises started to access international capital markets. This takes us to the next significant turning point in China's economic development. Its 2001 entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO. China's adoption of WTO principles, which include tariff reduction, increased transparency, and protection of intellectual property rights, has allowed it to become even more integrated into the global economy and has drawn even more international investment. The outcomes were astounding. Approximately $53 billion in foreign direct investment was made into China in 2002. That amount has increased to $108 billion by 2008. Millions of Chinese people deposited their rising salaries into banks, boosting the country's investment-led economic strategy. China's banking system functions under window guidance. in which the government sets the lending limits for banks, in contrast to market-driven economies. This has caused a property bubble that is currently on the verge of bursting due to widespread overinvestment. The CCP has supported large-scale infrastructure projects, encouraged rural areas to become more urbanized, and created a variety of sectors focused on exports. However, energy is a cost associated with all that manufacturing and building. China uses the most energy of any country in the world. Hence, fossil fuels make up a substantial portion of their energy mix. Every week, the nation approves the construction of 2 new coal-fired power plants. It is also the world's top crude oil importer, bringing in more than 10 million barrels daily, more than the combined output of the US and India. This places China in a difficult situation, as it must strike a balance between the requirement to maintain robust export markets and secure stable energy sources to keep its manufacturing engine running, and the necessity of using debt to finance expansion. Let's now discuss real estate. China's overheated real estate market.
China's real estate industry is collapsing in slow motion. These ghost cities, or residential buildings without tenants or construction that never finish, have become visual metaphors for the ongoing crisis.
That kind of really undermined the confidence among home buyers, because they were now worried that developers might not deliver the apartment that they had put a down payment on for. And so you then got essentially a confidence crisis among consumers who weren't able to trust developers to deliver the apartment they had paid for, at least in part. And so demand disappeared. There was lack of trust among buyers.
Taking on a little additional debt in the beginning of an investment-led growth strategy can be advantageous. Economic expansion can be accelerated by loans used to construct airports in mid-sized communities or roadways connecting major cities. But eventually, a nation must make the shift to a consumption-led economy, in which the wealth of its people and their need for products and services fuel economic expansion. Central planners are compelled to continue channeling investments toward progressively subpar possibilities if that shift doesn't take place. This results in major real estate developments devoid of tenants, secondary airports built in cities that don't require them, and dead ends on roads. China's building of homes has gone too far. The nation has enough unoccupied housing to accommodate up to 3 billion people, despite having a population of only about 1 billion. Without even including houses that are sold but incomplete or purposefully left empty as investments, there are over 7.2 million unsold homes. Ghost towns of abandoned high-rise buildings have been generated by this excessive building, and some provinces are facing completion schedules of more than 20 years for unfinished projects. Consequently, the current value of Chinese real estate is about 1/10 of what it once was. It's hardly an exaggeration, even though it sounds understated. This is an inescapable byproduct of China's export-driven investment-led economy. Keeping labor costs low to increase exports has long been a key component of the Chinese business model. Since paying employees more would reduce those profits, real estate has been the most effective means of wealth accumulation for the majority of Chinese households. The plan is straightforward: increase borrowing, purchase real estate, and watch as values soar. Isn't everyone happy? It makes sense that, in contrast to just 23% in the US, nearly 60% of Chinese household wealth is invested in real estate. China's real estate market is enormous, making up over 29% of the nation's GDP. To put things in perspective, housing in the United States usually contributes only 15 to 18% annually. Yet, the Chinese government is aware of the risks associated with an excessive reliance on real estate. China's focus is on common prosperity, and Xi Jinping's recent decision to crack down on the real estate industry is a signal that unrestrained wealth creation from real estate needs to be reined in. The government implemented measures like the 3 red lines, which are meant to restrict property developers' borrowing capacity in an effort to rein in the excesses. But it's easier said than done to dismantle a $50 trillion real estate bubble in an orderly manner. It may very likely set off the largest recession in modern history on balance sheets. A financial analysis.
That China's property sector is in not just disarray but in complete meltdown. I mean, we've seen, the collapse of China Evergrande, that huge company, one of the biggest property developers in the world at one stage, and then those problems ripple through the entire property development industry, and you've got a whole lot of other big players, Country Garden for instance, that are also in trouble. So It's been a problem that's been out there. Local investors, Chinese investors have lost a lot of money. Global investors have lost a lot of money. And everybody assumed years ago that the Chinese government would do something to inject some cash.
This is how it may happen. When home values start to decline, severely indebted individuals and developers' balance sheets are affected. They begin selling off properties to improve their financial situation, but few buyers are looking to take on new mortgages in a market where everyone is attempting to pay off debt. Lenders tighten their mortgage requirements as a result of the shortage of buyers, which drives down housing prices even further. This starts a vicious cycle that we refer to as a recession in balance sheets. China is currently attempting to boost demand by lowering loan rates, but this is unlikely to succeed because everyone knows that homes are too expensive, and Xi has made it plain that he won't intervene to save the market. China is reducing its interest rates, but the US, because the Federal Reserve is remaining unchanged, there is a growing difference in interest rates between the two nations. This exerts pressure on the yuan, the currency of China. Through a managed float mechanism, the People's Bank of China has kept the value of the yuan comparatively constant versus the US dollar for the last 20 years. This strategy has assisted in keeping China's exports exchange rate competitive. However, as China attempts to maintain the 7.20 yuan to dollar exchange rate, fissures are starting to appear. Why is any of this important? For the time being, China's capital restrictions and tiny capital market have kept the country's real estate industry's issues domestic. However, China is a significant investor in nations that are gaining from the Belt and Road Initiative, including Brazil, Australia, and others. When the flow of money from China begins to slow down, these countries may encounter severe difficulties. Although recent language and practices imply otherwise, some people are still holding out hope that the CCP will stabilize things by adding more money to the system. China's investment-led boom era may be coming to an end, and the slowdown will have an impact not only on the real estate market, but also on the country's whole economy, particularly on the steel, cement, and construction sectors. Around the world, inflation is a heated topic. It's out of control in places like Argentina and Turkey, and a political tempest in the US and Germany. Deflation, on the other hand, is a different beast to be concerned about in China. It's even more terrifying. Imagine a housing bubble burst that decimates the middle class's wealth in China, while enormous construction initiatives come to a grinding halt, displacing a sizable portion of the labor force. The Chinese government needs to figure out how to maintain at least some of this unstable system from collapsing in order to avert this catastrophe. However, how? By pouring money into other economic areas in the hopes of maintaining the stability of the entire house of cards. Although it's difficult to predict how much investment China would need to avert an economic catastrophe, analysts like Brian McCarthy advise that they should aim for an annual growth rate of over 10% to keep things from collapsing. This would need an annual increase in credit of almost $5 trillion, which would inevitably result in overstock in the export-oriented industries that the government currently emphasizes. Consider the electric vehicle, EV industry. The CCP is committed to seeing it through to success. They won't wait for a few dominant EV companies to emerge organically from the market. Instead, they would offer preferential prices to overseas EV manufacturers who choose to manufacture their cars in China. After that, they probably will make an effort to take as much intellectual property, IP, as they can. Armed with this information, they want to launch dozens of electric vehicle startups on the market, all of them supported by government grants and inexpensive bank loans. These businesses will engage in intense competition, with the winner emerging as a national champion because of its geopolitical significance, employment of the populace, and patriotic contribution. But there is a drawback to this tactic. The targeted sectors will experience overproduction as a result of the subsidies and low-cost loans. Despite the fact that China's population has been getting richer, the majority of this excess production will need to be exported due to a balance sheet recession. And the data is already demonstrating this. China is now exporting more than 40 million tons of steel. The number of passenger vehicles exported annually has increased to nearly 5 million. China has 4 times the capacity to produce all of the local market's needs in other industries, such as batteries. In the case of solar panels, Chinese production capacity considerably outpaces even the most optimistic projections of worldwide demand. What would happen then if these enormous supplies reached the borders of neighboring nations? Leaders have a difficult decision to make. Do they permit their customers to purchase these inexpensive goods? It might not seem like a huge deal if it's simply cheap t-shirts. But what about vital technological products that might destroy regional businesses that can't compete on price? Imports of foreign automobiles are already subject to levies from nations including the US, India, and Brazil. The steel, chemical, and agricultural sectors are those that the EU defends and that China's central planners have deliberately targeted. China's BRICS partners are beginning to feel uneasy as well. China's economic miracle may be coming to an end if its manufacturers are unable to find sufficient overseas markets in which to sell their products. The looming debt crisis.
It seems that more is needed to really fundamentally address the problems that are going on in the Chinese economy. And that means actually the government getting involved. But that's a huge step to take, more than these sort of cosmetic measures.
It's a rough road to recovery for China's economy. New data shows people are not spending enough money, the real estate crisis is unresolved, and investments into the country are drying up. This is happening as China is struggling to return to its booming pre-pandemic growth numbers. The country is looking at years of a sluggish economy ahead.
China is on the verge of collapse, and a significant energy shock could propel its enormous debt deflation into uncontrollable territory. What then occurs if a $50 trillion debt bubble pops? To begin with, the banks are in serious danger. These are the organizations that issued the majority of these loans, and their balance sheets show a large number of them. The 4 biggest banks in the world, all owned by the Chinese government and larger than JP Morgan, are located in China. Consider the largest bank in the world, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, which has over $3.5 trillion in loans under its belt, most of which are secured by real estate. Then there are the banks that have a substantial exposure to real estate loans: the Bank of China, the Agricultural Bank of China, and the China Construction Bank. In the event of debt deflation, these state-owned banks are left with no option. Businesses will collapse, jobs will evaporate, and the economic recession will get worse if they cease financing. However, if they continue to lend, they will accumulate a mountain of bad debt, which may eventually cause the bank's equity to disappear. The capital of offshore investors, in particular, would disappear as the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, frantically attempts to repair the country's balance sheet. The stockholders will be completely destroyed before the banks are eventually recapitalized. Furthermore, not just banks are at danger. The real estate bubble has been further inflated by wealth management products, trust loans, and shadow banking. Even when the official banking system tightened, these methods allowed developers to obtain financing and circumvent traditional banking restrictions. However, these instruments frequently have shorter maturities and higher interest rates, which makes them particularly more susceptible to a decline in the real estate market. The opaque and linked character of these products may amplify the consequences of a debt deflation scenario as default rates climb. What a cunning setup! As a result of defaults and foreclosures brought on by declining property values, banks and shadow banks are only able to seize the properties they were financing. They are unable to sell them. Whichever gets hit first in this scenario, it's going to hurt. When it comes to addressing the impending economic downturn, policymakers are left with very little choice. The last resort, devaluing the yuan. A significant devaluation of the yuan is the only lever they could possibly pull. By decreasing the real worth of outstanding liabilities, they might effectively inflate away a portion of the nation's debt by lowering the exchange rate from 7 yuan to 10 or 12 yuan per US dollar. This could lower the likelihood of widespread defaults and make it simpler for borrowers to pay off their loans. They depreciated the yuan by 3% in 2015, doing something similar at that time. The issue is that if they repeat the move, China's reserves of US dollars, held by the country's government as well as private businesses, would be negatively impacted. Importing food, energy, and industrial inputs would cost more since the yuan would not go as far in foreign markets. Furthermore, since China is already being accused of dumping goods and tariffs are rising, it wouldn't necessarily increase exports. Higher tariffs would probably result from a decline in export pricing. The Chinese economy is doomed if it continues to descend into energy instability, rapidly rising inflation, and declining wealth. What else could happen? Let us know in the comments section below. And if you have come this far, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.